Hi everyone. I just want to make a few comments on Leopold Sédar Senghor's essay that we have before us, Negritude and African Socialism. And as I've been trying to do over the last few weeks, really the 4 weeks at the beginning of this course is I guess a couple of things. Number one, kind of catch you up a little bit on on some of the kind of discourse around the central concepts of the course that have kind of laid themselves out within the Western tradition. So we've been reading lots of white guys, dead white guys. At the same time, each week I'm trying to kind of provide a voice that at least problematizes some of what we're reading in that week. And the goal of all of this is to give you a set of concepts that someone like Lorraine Code, who we're going to read in a few weeks, is going to push back against. And so I feel like in a course like this, you need the basis. You need to understand enough about the history of Western philosophy in order to understand what Code is up to. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we're simply going to endorse the kind of approaches that we've seen in the figures that we're reading. I want to be fair to them, right? I want to be fair to the things that maybe they got right, while critiquing the things that are still problematic. And I think you'll find that the figures that I'm having you read do the same thing, right? Certainly the person that we're looking at today, Senghor, I think does that, as well as next week with Sylvia Wynter. Both of them are deeply critical of the Western tradition, while at the same time not being blindly critical in a sense of not really understanding where things have come from, or what we've gained with liberalism, let's say, or something like that. So it's possible to be critical, in other words, while recognizing that there are alternatives that are also problematic, and we want to avoid those too. So back to Senghor. So Senghor is known for a few things. He was the president of Senegal, so that's a pretty big deal, president of his country for quite a while. He is also a figure understood as one of the originators of this thing called negritude. So, well, what is negritude and who's part of it? We could think of this as something that was developing really in the 1920s in mainly Paris, but also in Francophone countries within Africa. There was a kind of back and forth with the Harlem Renaissance at the time, so they were reading some of what was going on in France, in France they were reading some of what was going on in New York especially. And so there is some of that sense of thinking about race and thinking about black existence as something other than just a secondary sort of thing. What does it look like to truly be creative within this cultural space? Negritude is really less a philosophical movement than, let's say, an aesthetic and literary one. Senghor himself is known as a poet. Other figures, Léon Damas, for example, and Aimé Césaire are both known as poets as well. There were other associated figures, Césaire's ex-wife, Suzanne Césaire, is not so much a poet, but an essayist. And many of these figures were kind of fascinated with surrealism at the time, which was, had a lot of presence within Paris at the time. And so they saw surrealism as a kind of means of kind of shaking up the status quo and thinking about how do we get at elements that are not simply discursively available or simply logically, given to us. So it's really, in some sense, a kind of overturning of some of the Enlightenment presuppositions that might have been handed down. So we have Senghor here. He's giving this speech, and it is it's at Oxford, so he's giving it in English. And in this speech, he really is, in some ways, kind of disabusing people of some of the misunderstandings about negritude. These misunderstandings were often held by people in the West, sometimes they're also held by people in Africa. Famously, Wally Soyinka talked about negritude quite disparagingly, and he famously said, "A tiger does not proclaim its tigritude." So in other words, blacks do not need to proclaim their blackness. That's not necessarily a very productive thing. Senghor was often accused of being essentialist, so in some sense, saying something about the true internal nature of being black that was somehow fundamentally different. And as we know, certainly, they knew at the time, but we know even more today, that idea of separate but different is really a non-starter, because separate but different is always unequal, right? There's never a situation in which you can simply separate people off. You always end up putting them in some sort of hierarchy. So this was a problem, for example, with apartheid, which presented itself on the kind of proponents of apartheid as good neighborliness, and as if it was just, we have our place, you have your place, and everyone lives, like good neighbors. Of course, that's ridiculous. It was very much a racist and hierarchical system. So what Senghor is doing here is that he is trying to think about negritude as something other than that kind of very strong idea of contrast between what white experience is, white reason is, and black reason is. Oftentimes this is put as a contrast between what we might think of as discursive reason or logical reason on the one hand, which is what white people have, and emotional reason or intuitive reason, which is what blacks are supposed to have. And that's quite reductionist, right? I mean, that really suggests that there really is some kind of fundamental ontological difference between blacks and whites. Senghor never actually says that. He doesn't even mean it. And the the other proponents of negritude, like Amy Césaire, are even further away from suggesting that. None of them really want to think in those terms. What they want to do is to kind of drive a wedge in this kind of hierarchical, separate but equal sort of system, in which the West claims a sort of logical rigor, and then says that the rest of the world has to measure up to that. Because what comes along with logical rigor? Well, science, and technology, and lots of good stuff like this. And so it's very easy then to just kind of pit, science and technology and everything that comes with that, usually economic wealth and all of that sort of thing, on the one hand, and over on the other hand, art and music and all of those things that are less progressive, I guess, that don't build culture in the same way. You put all of those on the other hand, and and those are not the ones that have economic wealth attached to them. And so, like I just said, this separate but equal is never actually equal. What Senghor is interested in doing is thinking about how knowledge actually works, and he wants to tie that to ethics, to politics, to colonialism, certainly. He wants to get, as he says, he wants to get his listeners to put on a black skin for 5 minutes, as he says, right towards the beginning. He wants to get them, in other words, to think about what the lived experience of being black is actually like. Now, obviously, that's impossible if you haven't lived it, but he wants them to imaginatively put themselves in that position. It's at least possible to some small degree. And to think about the ways in which, especially things like colonialism, have caused a huge amount of damage. He wants to tie to that the idea of capitalism as a kind of outgrowth of colonialism. And so, from our vantage point, I mean, this was a lecture that he gave in 1961. From our vantage point, those two things are, there's been a lot of talk about the tie between colonialism and capitalism. At the time, I think there was less discussion about the obvious, relationship between those two things. And so I think, in 1961, he's saying something that, it's not that people wouldn't have thought of it, but they would have not given it much weight. Let's put it that way. colonialism was an economic enterprise as well as a moral one and a political one and all the rest of that, right? I mean, it was about transporting, raw materials, goods and services, and of course slaves, to different places, and all of the benefits of that went to Europe. And so, it's founded on economic, and particularly capitalist sort of idea of how the world should be organized. And it's founded, obviously, also on a fundamentally unequal and racist view of how the world should be organized, right? I mean, who's doing the organizing? The Europeans, and they're the ones reaping the benefits from it. So, what does Senghor actually say about negritude? Well, on 440, you can see his definition right at the top. He defines it as the whole complex of civilized values, cultural, economic, social, and political, which characterize the black peoples, or more precisely, the Negro-African world. All these values are essentially informed by intuitive reason. So there's that notion of intuitive reason. Because this sentient reason, the reason which comes to grips, expresses itself emotionally through that self-surrender, that coalescence of subject and object, through myths, by which I mean the archetypal images of the collective soul. Above all, through primordial rhythms, synchronized with those of the cosmos. In other words, the sense of communion, the gift of myth-making, the gift of rhythm. Such are the essential elements of negritude, which you will find indelibly stamped on all the works and activities of the black man. So, somebody outside of, the tradition of negritude might look at this and say, aha, there it is. He has just now defined the essence of being black. Well, no, actually he hasn't. Right? What he said is that there is a way of being in the world that foregrounds these values. Does it mean that it does not foreground logic? Not at all, right? I mean, there's still logic, there's still reason, there's still science and the potential for science, there's still all sorts of other things. But what he's trying to say is that all of this stuff has received relatively little attention within the West because of the idea that true reason is scientific reason. And so, things like myth fall away in the Enlightenment, things like religion, things like, music becomes very structured. So the classical music through, 18th, 19th century, becomes, highly codified, highly structured. You have symphonies, you have all of these sorts of things. And yeah, there's emotion there. I mean, I'm not suggesting there's no emotion in that music. But when he's looking at it, he's looking at whether there's participation in that music. And what he's seeing is music playing at the front of a concert hall, and everyone sitting in their seat, and the participation is limited to clapping like that, right? As over against music that moves you, music that moves your feet, music that you have to participate in. So that's what he's got in mind, right? He's got in mind this idea that you cannot stay apart from the kind of way that the world operates, the knowledge about the world and in the world. You can't stay apart from your community. You can't stay apart and suppose that you have an objective stance to anything. You don't sit back and look at, listen to music or look at a play or do any of this sort of stuff as if you're not somehow implicated by it. You're not part of it. And so when I hear him talking about intuitive reason, that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that there is this idea that has been forgotten and lost within the West, which is that we are really implicated by all of our experiences, including music, including everything else. So, what he's interested in then is thinking about what implications this might have for things like politics. And he talks about, on the bottom of 441, talks about the African mode of socialism. And we need to read that a little bit carefully, I think, because when we see the word socialism, we might automatically think of, kind of European context in which there's, right-wing political thought and left-wing political thought, capitalism and socialism, or further out communism or something like that. And, he's using the terms that he has available to him at the time, but I think it's problematic, and I think he shows that it's problematic in the way he talks about socialism. So he comes out against, for example, syndicalism on 444, and if you don't know what that is, you should look it up, but it's very, basically the idea that ownership of the means of production within a society should be transferred to groups like workers' unions. Okay, and he's not particularly interested in that sort of thing. I mean, that's not what he's got in mind when he thinks about socialism. What he thinks about socialism is what he calls an African socialism, which means economic democracy and spiritual freedom. Right. So in some ways, it feels closer to some versions of anarchism that we have today, and anarchism can mean a lot of different things, but some of them come pretty close to that version. He lists his elements of his version of African socialism. It has to be community-based, communal, but not collectivist. Okay, so in other words, he's pushing back against kind of doctrinaire Marxism as well. He's not interested in that notion of history coming to a head and there being a kind of turnover into something that looks more like, the state ownership of means of production or central planning. He's just totally not interested in any of that kind of stuff. What he's interested is in this idea that we cannot separate ourselves off as individuals from the world in which we find ourselves. Especially our communities, especially our histories, right? This is why we can talk about things like ancestors, for example, or witchcraft, or things like that within Africa. And from a Western point of view, we might look at that and say, well, prove to me that there are these beings like ancestors floating around out there. Prove to me that witchcraft has causal, force in the world. In other words, an incantation will actually make something happen. Prove those things to me first. And that kind of misses the point within that African context, because those things are really representing the connection that we have not just to our communities, but to the history of our communities, right? That's what ancestors are, right? We need to remember what has been handed down to us, what's come down to us. It's not just that we're inventing the world all anew again right now. We are thinking about community in that very expansive sense, not just my family, not just my local neighborhood, but really, everyone that's stretched behind me, everyone that comes before me, and a larger world. And we need to figure out how do we find ourselves in conversation with that larger world. And so he actually uses the term humanism, neo-humanism, in the context of all of this. And where he ends up is with a very humanist kind of virtue, which is love. Negritude is a way of organizing that foregrounds love rather than material wealth. And this is where his pushback against capitalism comes back in. It is, the problem with capitalism is that it foregrounds material wealth, and love is just trampled. It's just forgotten. It's gone, right? There's no possibility because everything has a number attached to it. We know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And so, what he's interested in, that's what he is seeing. That's what negritude is about for him. It's reaccessing those kinds of values of community, of love for each other, of love for one's history, and the creativity that comes out of that. And so being plugged into, emotionally plugged into that history, into those people and all of those sorts of things, allows you to encounter the world anew and create something anew, not on the standards of someone else, some colonizing power or something like that, but on the standards of your community. You can be who you are. That's what he's after. And so thought of that way, it's less about, essentialism. It's less about saying, here is, the true essence of blackness or something like that. That's not really what this is about at all. And so you can see in some ways how this, gives maybe a little bit different vision about, really our core concepts are, epistemology. What does it mean to know? Well, you know not just with your head, but with your whole body, right? You know while you move through the world. You know while you dance. You know all of those things, not just this up here. Ethics means acting in love, right? It does not just mean, thinking about the calculus in your head, which tells you what the right action is to do under certain circumstances. And social organization, well, this is much more organic than what we're going to see in many of the other figures that we've been looking at. So, I think he really gives a different kind of picture of what all of this looks like. And so I wanted you to take a look at someone like Senghor because, I think when we come later on to Lorraine Code, she may not explicitly draw on, African text, but there's some echo in some of this. And the echo comes in part through feminism, and it comes in part through environmentalism and various other things that she is explicitly working with. But I think we can also see it here. So anyway, that is a little bit about negritude and Senghor, and I hope you enjoyed the reading, and I look forward to what you have to say about it in the discussion area.